And it's one of the best comic stories of all time. So listen, tell me how that idea came about to bring Darkseid into the Legion as an adversary.
Well, I think there's a couple of pieces to the puzzle. And my memory on most of these things is pretty foggy. But one, I really liked, still do like, building stories that have a puzzle element to them. And one of my real regrets from my first run on Legion in the mid-70s, besides the fact that I regretted that I had overcommitted myself to too many different projects and it opened up too many fill-ins, I sort of screwed it up that way. But my other one was the Earth War, which I thought was the best story I had plotted and designed to that point. Ended up getting screwed up because it went through multiple artists. So it really just never held together as well as it was a story. And in coming back to the Legion, sort of on the checklist of, okay, sins to make up for from last time, there's not going to be one fucking thing here. What I have to do, I'm doing every issue of this book until I'm done. I want to do another long story. I want to hold all the parts. I want to do it in a way that it can all be held together. I was an enormous fan of Jackson Riddell. That was some of the first work that I got to see in progress when I was doing the early fanzines and wandering around the DC office. Jack was always both an enormous favorite artist and somebody that I personally liked a great deal. And I got to know him in the field. He and Ross were always very kind, not just to me, but anybody I met, any of the aspiring writers and artists. And I'm a lousy film creator. It's not one of my strengths as a writer. So borrowing the Legion has a few really good films, but not a great day. Same with Batman. So the idea that I could borrow really one of the great villains of all time and bring him into the 30th century, because he could be in any century. This was the god of evil in many ways. This sort of all put together very naturally. It may have been Keith's suggestion too, because Keith was an enormous Kirby fan. And he, even in those days, would always be popping his head up. Why don't we do this? About a third of Keith's suggestions in most of his creative career, no one should ever listen to. And about a third of them are really insanely brilliant. They're okay. As good as anyone else's out there. But he's an extraordinarily fertile mind. And in those years, he didn't think of himself as a writer, but he really already clearly showed that he was and could be. And I'm so glad that he's gone on to be a writer for many, many years since. I think that's how it happened. We certainly didn't realize that we were creating something anybody would be talking about 30 years later. In looking back, I realized that it was the first time ever for DC, and really, we talked about this at dinner the other night, only the second time in comics history that one of the mainstream publishers made an issue longer because of the story for that final chapter. Chris had pulled it off with the end of the Phoenix saga about 6 months or half a year, a little more than half a year before. And it was like, yeah, we could do that. And that's how we got to that extra long final issue too.
Well, I recently reread in the new deluxe format, and relatively new, and the mystery aspect holds up. And of course, I knew who the mystery villain was, but do you remember the mail at that point? I mean, were readers playing, or fans playing a guessing game? Were they figuring out that it was Darkseid?
Yeah, we had one or two who figured it out. You know, my goal as a mystery writer has always been that I think you try to design the mystery novel so that the reader gets it the page before you reveal it. You want the reader who's really working at it to be able to figure the puzzle out and to have sort of that joy of triumph over the writer, but not to insult them if they don't get it. That when they turn the page, they feel stupid for not having figured it out. It should be kind of that glow of amusement, and we certainly had a fair amount of that going on. The issue of who the servants were, I remember certainly there was an enormous amount of speculation about who the servants were early on. And it was one or two letter writers early on who guessed the first couple of servants. I don't think there was anyone who got all 5.
Well, refresh our memory. Tell us who the 5 servants.
Oh God, I gotta remember now. We had the Owen. We had Shadowglass's great-great-grandmother, or whatever that was. We had Orion. We had the Superman clone.
Calabac.
Oh, Camelback? Okay. It's been a while. I mean, I've read it in soon 30 years. But I also have, at this point, a memory that used up way too much of its knowledge on remembering home planets of Legionnaires. That's why I have to read Paddington Bear sign in the airport. Please ship me back home to...
Well, not only was that a very effective use of Darkseid, but that character had been dormant in print for a couple of years at that point, right? There was really nothing going on.
Yeah, and actually the gap was really as long as we think it was. The mythology built up around that story is that's the story that brought Darkseid into the DC universe. But there was a JLA-JSA team up in the year or two before that, and there was another run of New Gods when I was editing it, where we treated with those characters, so that was 79 maybe, so that's just 3 years or so before that. So it wasn't like he was dormant, but he certainly wasn't as omnipresent as he is.
Good way of putting it. You wrote another of the great Legion mysteries, who is Censor Girl. Tell us about that.
We were coming off the Crisis stuff, and for a while we were debating, could we figure out a way to get Supergirl back in the Legion, somehow get around her death and her revision. Could she have survived? Or could there be a period when she, in an earlier life, when she'd been there? And started to develop a storyline around that, and then got vetoed in some fashion or another. So how do we build this? And managed to get people to fun. And that was one of the enormous letter writing, because that ran, it's the better part of a year, the storyline.
That one was really packaged more as a mystery, where the Great Darkness saga was a mystery, but I don't think it was really...
it wasn't marketed as a mystery.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but, I mean, all of those, and Brad Meltzer, the first time I met him, he was wandering through DC, he started talking to me about the Legion stuff that he grew up on, of mine. And Brad's a wonderful sort of official mystery writer, much better mystery writer than I am. And started immediately going into Censor Girl was the one they said was the best mystery, but I really think it was the Universal Project. I think that was a better structured mystery. It's wonderful meeting readers and sort of seeing what they've got on.
Well, you grew up reading Jim Shooter's.
Yeah,
right.
Ed Hamilton and Shooter's, Jerry Siegel.
But I remember reading in a few introductions you've written that Shooters had a special connection because of his age, and yours at the time.
Yeah, well, I remember sitting on my stoop in Brooklyn reading the letter column where they talked about Jim being 13 years old. I was 9. Yeah, 13 was like an age people actually got to. So maybe you can grow up as opposed to these ancient guys who read their biography and writing stories 20 years before.
And how old were you when you eventually started working part-time in DC?
16. I'll be finishing up finishing up 40 years there this Christmas.
Congratulations.
Well, you guys have let me get away with avoiding honest work for a
Well, let's talk about how you started on the Legion and your first door in as his runner.
Well, my first touch of the Legion was getting to do Karate Kid. In the 70s, the way DC was structured, a very small company, 30, 35 people working in DC when I started there. But it was the last years when an individual editor pretty much owned a property and owned the set of freelancers. So the office next to Joe Orlando's, Joe was my boss and my mentor, was Murray Boltnoff's. And among the things Murray owned was the Legion of Superheroes. And with it, he sort of owned Cary Bates and, to a large extent, Mike Grell, and sort of occasionally loaned Grell out to other editors because Legion was enough to keep busy. I would love to have worked with the Legion. Cary was not particularly interested in that book, but got to make a living. But there wasn't a chance while I was Joe's assistant. I got that phone. It just wasn't part of his team. And then in one of the usual moments in DC's history where, as legendarily was put in the industry, as soon as DC jumps on a trend, you can be guaranteed the trend is over. Carmine came around and said, martial arts stuff is hot. You know, do something on that. And Joe suddenly had a book that was due in 2 minutes, having something to do with martial arts. Nobody knew anything about martial arts in the room. Denny was doing Kung Fu Fighter down the hall. Denny actually knew something about the subject. And I piped up and said, well, there's this Karate Kid character in Legion, and Legion's doing all right, maybe we can spin him out. And somehow we got that through, and I got to write an issue, plotted another one, and then Carmine sort of noticed that I hadn't yet learned how to write. Yes, sir. And said, let's not use this kid as a writer for a while until he sort of figures out what he's doing. So David Michelini ended up finishing up that series, or finishing up the second issue and staying on the series for a bunch of issues. And about, I guess about 6 months later, Carmine had departed, and Murray was invisibly retired. Murray was very young-looking 65. Nobody knew he was 65. He was determined that nobody would know. These were the years when there was mandatory retirement was still a legal thing in this country. He had hit 65 and retired. Folks coming in every day, working from 9 to 5, and freelance editing all the books he'd been doing the day before. And nobody but Carmine and the Human Resource Department knew he retired. But then Carmine was gone, and Jim and Conroy started to juggle around. And they noticed that Murray really was retired. They started to ease off his workload a little bit, and then moved Legion over to Denny to edit. And right about that same time, Jim Shooter had been writing Legion and come back. And Jim got the offer to be the associate editor of Marvel. Associate editor of Marvel in those days was a very serious job. It's the #2 editor of the shop. As opposed to today when the title sort of means, well, you're not an assistant editor anymore, you know how to do more than Xerox, but really we're not going to allow you to sharp objects. Maybe that's but anyway, it was a very good job offer for Jim, so Jim was coming off to do that, so Legion was available. And as I think I wrote in the last Legion archives, I don't really remember where I killed anyone in the Denny's office. There really wasn't much of a chance anyone else was going to write that book at that point. I ended up writing it, not very well.
And who were you paired with artistically?
illustration of Human Motion. And Mike Nasser, who was nicknamed Funky, who was one of the crusty bunkers in the studio. Character and a half, but wonderfully dynamic artist.
And so when did that first stint come to an end? And tell us how you got back into the project later.
Oh, I guess the first stint ran about 2.5 years, something like that. I would say it was way too many introductions. And then DC was going through what became known as the DC implosion, tremendous shrinkage of the line, and we really had a nasty game of triage to play. It was almost musical chairs. So we had a lot of guys who had freelance writing contracts, a lot of people who were just freelancers who were trying to make a living. I, of course, had a day job to pay my salary. I was freelancing on the side. So I couldn't keep doing as much stuff as I've been doing before. It was not right or fair or sane. So when the dust settled, I had given up Legion. I was stuck with some of my other assignments. I really lightened my schedule an awful lot at that point. I figured, no, I had my shot, I screwed it up. That's that. Most people would get their shot. And went off and wrote other stuff for it's about 3 years. And then Mike Barr took over as editor of Legion. I guess maybe 1. And Roy was writing the book. Roy was never a big Legion fan. So he was looking to get off it. And we did some kind of strange, complicated trade. Mike came to me and asked me if I'd like to go back on the book. And I said, screwed up once. He said, a lot of characters. We talked into it. Thankfully. And somehow or other, Jerry was writing something, and Roy was writing Legion, and I don't even remember what the hell I was writing. Maybe the newspaper strip. Yeah, it was the newspaper strip. So maybe Jerry got the newspaper strip, and Roy got Wonder Woman, some kind of bizarre trade like that, and I ended up getting Legion. And I decided to determine not to screw it up that time. So I stuck it out for 100 issues in a row. Baxter, cleaned up my reputation a little bit.
You worked with quite a few talented artists that I think that for many folks, the book, well, obviously the book really clicked with you and Keith Giffen together. You have great chemistry, and you helped elevate Legion to what, the #2 title of DC during the early 80s?
For most of my run, most of my second run was DC's second most profitable title. There was always the Blip of the Dark Knight or something like that, but basically the bread and butter titles, it was Teen Titans and Legion. Were the two big run players for the shop.
So please toss modesty out that exit door to your right and tell me what it is that you think that you brought, and Keith at that time in particular, to that book that made it such a strong fan favorite, because as many people in this room know, Legion has a very loyal readership, but it hasn't always been a large readership, and you were successful at increasing the numbers of the book.
Well, I mean, bear in mind, Legion in Shooter's Day and Hamilton's Day outsold Batman many of those years. Those were days when if you had a Superman S on a DC book, it could outsell anything else. Lois Lane outsold Batman for a lot of years. As much as I love Kurt Schaffenberger and Leo Dorfman, I don't think anybody's ever going to claim that that's a matter of my art. When I look back on it, I think a lot of there was simply that we were at a moment of change in what was going on in the Levitz. And both Keith and I had as natural tastes things that were a hair ahead of our time for DC. It's not that we were doing that fabulous comic book. I think in many ways Teen Titans was a much better written and drawn book. The characters were better delineated in many, many ways, more revolutionary. But the style of what we were doing, the kinds of stories, were ahead of their pace. And you I look back with a lot of pride in the things that went on in the book. The level of maturity of the characters, the level of some of the themes that we talked about, the fact that the actions of the characters was powerful. I was looking at when I was signing some giant stack yesterday at the moment that Projectra kills her husband's murderer. I think that's the first time in a superhero comic in America that a superhero kills the villain in a sort of justice fashion. That happens a lot these days. I'm not sure that should happen a lot, but it made sense in that story. You had a character who was regal, who had historically the right to dispense royal justice, and certainly she watched her husband get beaten to death. It wasn't really surprising that she wanted to go faster. Is that great writing? I don't know that it's great writing, but it was a kind of moment you couldn't do, certainly at DC, and couldn't basically do in American superhero comics before that moment. It was 4 months into our doing, 5 months into doing Legion as a direct-only book. So it was the first moment, really, first superhero comics to be done without the cover. And we took advantage of that moment of opportunity and did bunches of things. Whether it was that, or we go back and the relationship that developed between Shrinking Violet and Lightning Lass in those years, which I'm still not entirely sure whether I wrote deliberately or whether the characters decided that themselves and sort of put it in there. But it's stuff that today you can do routinely, thank God. The material is still the million mobs and all their stupidity arguing about it. But we began to be able to deal with a wider range of subject material than a lot of the DC books were doing at the time.
I think you're selling yourself short if you don't think that you delineated those characters as well as Marv did in Titans. He had 7. You had 70. I think you were successful at more clearly establishing the personalities of many of them. Some of them always had stronger personalities, but some of them were added because of their comic and never had an opportunity maybe until you were at the helm to really flesh them out as real characters.
I think, the combination of Marv and George were ahead of us in that. And some of it, yes, they had 7. We had not 7, way too many. But some of it is also, both of them were really, really good at the small moments, sort of the human natural moments, and that really fleshes a character tremendously. That was not nearly as much our strength over the movie. But they were certainly more human when we were done with them than they were when we started. I'm proud of that.
Another parallel between Legion and Titans in the early 80s was the relationship between the writer and artist. Because Keith really evolved from being just a penciler to a co-plotter.
Well, Keith's description of a lot of how he worked in that period is he'd read my plot on the bus back to Jersey and crumple it up and throw it out and draw the book. And often Keith would draw, mostly drew it as plotted, but he'd come back and he'd do a 2 or 3 page scene that was nothing whatsoever to do with what was in the plot. And then often I would dialogue and write something over it that was nothing to do with what he had in his margin notes. But we agreed enough on the sense of who the characters were and the tone of what we were trying to do that there was a natural chemistry to it. And that's always been one of the joys of working with him. Working with him on Legion. Our all-star moments were checkered. Very young. But when you know who the characters are, then the rest can go in many directions. We were pretty good at that.
What are some good experiences you have with some of the artists who
guys that I got. Here's a minute of Gene Colan, here's a minute of Carmine, getting Joe Orlando to do an issue. So many of the greats that I grew up in, all the jobs I got out of Kurt Swan. Oh, Paul, you gotta give me Legion again. I swear, Kurt, I'll only use 3 characters. Not too many aliens. Not too many spaceships. I mean, I grew up loving his work on Legion. I'd always try and juggle the schedule to get him to fill in. Steve Lytle, who's back doing a little bit of Legion work now. He's doing some covers for us, just a short story for one of the issues. Greg LaRocque, who was on it for a long stretch. So many folks over the years. I was looking at one of the fill-in issues again as I was signing yesterday. I remember Eric Larson from the story with me. So many great people who've gone on to other interesting things. Helen Moran, that great Ellen Flanagan. If you haven't checked out Gone to America, the graphic novel that she did for Vertigo that came out with her issue, you should. It's really extraordinary novel. Good story too.
Well, you returned to Legion a few years ago, so tell us how that happened. That was part of a broader progression in your career.
Yeah, well, I certainly did work again. We got to the point where I'd been at the day job long enough, and I was getting up from the big desk, and the Warner Brothers executives that we were in the process of working that out said, so, what do you want to do next? I said, well, I'm going to write, I'm going to teach. And so the company was stuck with me writing a couple of books a month. And it happened to be at exactly the moment when Jeff Johns had brought back the Legion, sort of recognizably as my Legion, because that was the time he had grown up on it. And they needed a new writer for it. It was almost perfect timing for something like that.
And now you're writing the new 52s version of the Legion. And what challenges does that present to you? The overall tone of the line tends to be a little darker than the optimism, even despite the chaos and the murder and the horrible things that would happen in stories. Still, there was always, I think, that's one of the magical things of Legion is that we have hope that 1,000 years from now we can work out some of the things that we can't seem to get right today.
Well, if we don't, we're not going to make it 1,000 years. It always seemed to me as a writer that rationally the only way to write about the human race being here 1,000 years from now is the assumption that we stop being complete assholes. I'm a great believer in the power of science to fix things. I don't know how we fix global warming, but I have optimism that we will, either by behaving better or some scientist somewhere in some basement will come up with the magic potion that does it. But in terms of being human, if we keep saying blue people and green people, all blue people have to try and kill all green people now, whatever labels we're sticking on people, we ain't going to make them 1,000 years. We have to solve that. We have to. God bless Rodney King. Can't we all just get along? Poor man passed away this week. We got to figure that out. And given my family background and history, that's always been a significant issue for me in looking forward. So I can't envision a future where we haven't figured those things out. Doesn't mean there won't still be issues, but better not be that. One of the real challenges of coming back to the Legion is Jeff had just done that Earthman story that was driven by xenophobia and how to kind of work my way through that, because for the new 52, the guys wanted the book to be a little younger, so we folded in the Legion Academy characters and we gave them maybe a little more screen time than otherwise I might have. That's making for some interesting stories here. There are interesting characters here. Working in between signings downstairs on a story to finally get around to telling Laura the story. Start to work on that for Portello. be a lot of fun.
What's your relationship like with Francis Portello?
Well,
He's doing beautiful work.
he's a wonderfully talented man. You know, when the big change from when I was a kid, when I came into comics, everybody had to be within a few miles of Manhattan to work in comics. So everybody would get the invention of FedEx, changed that a little bit, and then the invention of the digital transmission work has changed it enormously. So in recent years, I open the morning email, and there's something from Istanbul, from Eury, and there's something from Francis in Barcelona, and stuff just flying around. Something George is saying, I'm off to a convention tomorrow. Here's just this page is a little rougher than I expected it to be, but it'll finish up world's finest, so we'll just make it. Here you go. Very, very different world. So I don't get to know Francis the way Keith, who was in and out of it. But last time he was in New York, we had a nice meal, and I said, you really should be in charge of Spain in the 31st century. What would you like it to be? What do you want? He lives in Barcelona. What do you want Barcelona to be in the 31st century? So he said, well, there's a legend that the Gaudi Cathedral will never be finished. We'll just keep getting built. Maybe that will be a role of Barcelona by the 31st century. So when an artist puts his drawing hand in his mouth, that I do my best to close it on him. Figure out how to actually draw that. It's going to be a lot of fun.
And you're doing World's Finest, and you have returned to Huntress as well as now you're doing Power. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
Now, Huntress is another character that you're very well identified with, and the new 52. I've only read the first issue. The second one just came out, right? A week or so ago. I haven't gotten it yet. But there are a few nuances, nods to the previous incarnations. And what is this? How do you work through trying to synthesize some things from the past and creating something that is new that still has that same smell for and taste for the readers who have been with the character for a long time?
Well, you start out, I think, trying to think about what people loved about the character. It's a different challenge in this World's Finest, but in both cases, can you make a story that somebody loved from 30 years ago not count? Yeah, I think you can. But can you make the emotional moment of that not count? Or what can you violate without offending that sense of somebody's inner 12-year-old? That's really the balance in the process. So, in Legion, because it's the new 52, we're going to have the Fatal 5 coming up, but the Legion will not have met a Fatal 5 before. But there'll have been a Fatal 5 that's been around in the 31st century for a while. So some of the things may have happened. In my head, you sort of enter and say, well, so Adventure 352, 353 happened, but it was just the Sun Eater that ended up getting Feral Lab. And they don't have to have met the Fatal 5 in that story. Because really, if you take the Fatal 5 out of that story, the story still sort of would work with a couple of adjustments. So that's how that history works. I don't know that that will ever be mentioned in any of the comics, but you sort of do that kind of edit. So that's one part of the process. The other part, when you look at something like Power Girl and Huntress, what did people love about those two characters? Well, I think they loved the film and the movies. That book is really a buddy comedy. Is it a Cagney and Lacey? Is it a Thelma and Louise? And, you can argue what model you're at. But these are two very different women with very different takes on the world who are really, really good friends. And they're dealing with all this weird shit. And you should be able to recognize them in many ways if you loved them before. If you've had a relative or a dear friend who you haven't seen for 10 or 20 years, and then you meet them again, their life has changed, they're in a different role, and now a parent or a grandparent or a professional. But do you see what you loved about them and what you cared about? Are they still the practical joker, or are they still the warm, cuddly person? You know, what carries you forward in that? How do you extract that piece of them? If Dick walked in the room, Michael had the fun of working for Dick Giordano for a bunch of years and being very close to him. If Dick walked in the room today, what would we expect to see? You know, the Dick you worked with in the 80s was a little different than the Dick that I hung around with in the 70s or that I worked with in the early 90s, because his life was at different stages. But the warmth of him as a human being, the upbeatness was always there. And the sweet Rob, I want to sweet Rob Roy straight up at lunch.
Two, actually.
Maybe when I was there, I kept on his good behavior. You know, was a consistent little trademark. So the little things and the emotive things become the consistent hallmarks that help us define character.
Well, I look forward to reading what you will do with those characters and the other issues. And I have to admit that I actually read World's Finest 1 before I read, or 2, 1. That was the one that just really called out to me. Before we open the floor for questions, we must talk about your big book.
It's a big book.
It is larger than a dorm refrigerator. You're figuring that out. Could put...
Well, you can't microwave it. It's definitely an unmicrowavable book, also because they have all those foil pages. Really screw up your microwave pretty badly.
But of course, we're talking about make sure I get the title correct. The DC is 75?
75 years of DC Comics, the art of modern myth-making.
Thank you. How did that book start?
Well, about 2 years before DC's 75th, Cheryl Rubin, who ran our licensing department for many years, and her team began figuring out some stunts we could do to celebrate. And they went out and they pitched 4 or 5 very high-end publishers on doing a book on DC's 75th. And one of them was Tasha, which is a very quirky art book publisher. And Benedict Tasha, who founded the company, actually started running a comic shop that's in Cologne, Germany, many years ago when he was a kid. So he's loved this material. He was a Uncle Scrooge guy, not a Superman guy, but still loved comics as a medium. Still is a very hands-on publisher. He still approves every visual image that goes into the books. And they ultimately did the winning bid for the book, proposal, and came up with this vision for doing this monster physical project. Because Tashin has a history of doing these colossally expensive and gorgeous books. They have a famous book on Ali, greatest of all time. Not only was a dorm room refrigerator, but probably was a Sub-Zero refrigerator. Just a monster book. Steve Corte, who's the guy on Cheryl's staff, who's the editor responsible for the project, asked me if I would like to write the written part of it. I was like, I can't, I got a day job. So the art director, a man named Josh Baker, Steve, and Tasha, and Ian Meyer, went to work on the book. They spent about 2 years assembling the revisions, some great searching, and went to England to photograph from the collection of Ian Levine, who's one of the 5 or 6 people in the world who has a complete set of DCs. And a little side story on Ian. So as Ian was closing in on his full set of DCs, he used to run little ads and things like whatever the modern equivalent of the buyer's guide was, listing the handful of things that he still needed. He was looking for the weirdest obscure shit. But a lot of them were custom comics. The Black & Decker Dustbuster comic that DC did. Not things that anyone would necessarily ever want to read. But one of those appeared Christmas week when I was in the office and I was utterly bored. There's not much going on. So I said, all this stuff, we've got tons of it, isn't worth anything. So I went digging in my files for a few minutes, threw a dozen of them together, stuffed them in an envelope and mailed them to Ian Vanille and said, buy 40,000, get 12 free. It happened to be the right day. Didn't often do comic giveaways that way. It seemed he deserved it. Anyway, so they had all this incredible stuff put together. And then I was walking away from the big desk, and Steve said, "You still haven't found our writer. It's due in about 2 minutes. You can do this faster than anybody else on the planet because you know it better. How about it?" Okay. It's a lot of fun. It was a great chance to revisit some of the people who showed me, just immerse myself in their stories a little bit. I mean, I couldn't do justice to anything because we only had 3/4 of a word per issue in the DC public. Hopefully it gave people the right flavor. It was a wonderful debut as a prose writer.
We are going to let some folks in this room ask you some questions, starting with you. First one.
Big fan of your work, sir. I'm just curious, and Mike said all around it, but I'm curious as you as a writer. I mean, he literally opened the panel saying, "You wrote the best Legion story ever," and that's a very true statement. But my question is, how is it to literally be competing with yourself as a writer?
I don't think of it that way. I mean, I don't. The things that made The Great Darkness, if it is the best Legion story, was in large part the moment it came out. And I don't know that I have it in me to be ahead of the curve again in that kind of fashion. There was a lot of forces coming together at that moment. I'm just really happy that nobody's telling me, "Would you go back to the old timers day game and get off the damn field? Let the new kids really play baseball because they're in shape to do it." So as long as you guys are still letting me play, that's just fine.
Move Legion into DC animation.
We tried to sell Legion for animation for about 30 years. And I think the first time we developed it with Warner Animation, there really wasn't a big Warner Animation unit. It was 77 or 78. I remember doing some work with Gene McCurdy at that time. And eventually we got the series on the air for about 3 years. Kind of cute. Never took off enormously, but it's kind of nice to see it happen.
Talking more of the epic movie that JLA and Batman and Superman are now commanding.
Yeah, I don't think we get there easily. I mean, the way Warner Home Video works, which makes very good business sense, is very heavily driven by market research. And they have to finance these projects. They have to be able to sell humongous numbers of them. So they go out and they market research and they test the moms to buy for the kids for recognition. They test the kids for what they're screaming for their mom to buy. The answers keep coming back: Superman, Batman, Justice League. Look, I never would have envisioned a lot of what's happened with the characters, not just my characters, but comic characters in general. If you had told the 12-year-old me that there would be an Avengers movie with all the characters doing all that great stuff, grossing $1 billion, or whatever the inflation equivalent of it would have been in those years, I would have said, this is impossible. If, on the other hand, if you told me I would live to hold in my hand, a palm-sized computer that can do more than the IBM 360 I learned to program on, I'd have said you're nuts. So who the hell knows what will happen? But I don't think you're going to see it next week.
This is more in the line of a suggestion or a question as to the future direction of the comic. First of all, are we going to see Legion Wedding anytime soon, specifically, and specifically given the current developed, called the high-profile discussion of getting married in comics, or are Vi and Eli ever going to get married? Joe and Tina?
marriage really will look like 1,000 years from now. Again, if we're going to be alive, we're going to stop having stupid rules about who can marry who. And we're going to just be really pleased that people actually love each other and don't want to kill each other. We don't have any current plans for it. They're very happy. They're a couple. I don't know that in 31st century terms they're not as married as they need to be. I wouldn't have any problems doing a same-sex marriage in the region as a writer.
They're also younger at this point.
Yeah, the current incarnation is a little younger, but I don't think this stuff can be a big deal if that's what you're now. It really, we don't make it if we don't suffer. We don't get past this stuff.
The question,
Being a writer and an editor, what's one thing you regret an editor didn't let you do, and what's something you regret now that you didn't let a writer do?
Jeez. My main regret, not so much an editor, but the editorial direction, was, and it's not anybody's particular fault, was the need to get Superboy out of the Legion and edit that out from John with his revision. I still think there was a way to solve that I couldn't sell the shop on in those years. As an editor, better work. You know, it's just when I look back on the run of stuff that I did as an editor, I think they are as solid books as DC published in those years. But there's very little that I worked on as an editor that survives the test of 30 years later, somebody's looking back on it and wanting to read it. And that's true of the vast majority of comics. I mean, again, I'm not saying my batting average wasn't even better than average, but it didn't stand up to the best days that people had. And I kind of wish I had more of Archie Goodwin's batting average, where a higher proportion of what he worked on in those years of his life survives.
You mentioned the challenges following Jeff Johns' Earthman story. I wonder if you talk about that a little bit, because when I read it, I was surprised to find out that he was still such a major character when you started writing the book. And why you're interested in him, why you didn't just drop him, what you're doing with him.
Well, I thought it was a way to introduce the issue of xenophobia to the main storyline and have someone grow out of it. One of the wise-ass lines about writing is the argument that there are really only two stories. Good man turns bad and bad man turns good. I don't really buy that, but it still is one of the fundamental things. So that being able to take someone who was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong and take him past his racism seemed to me a potentially important story to do. And that, in part, was what payoff with Shadowlands in the process. There's a wonderful body of research that's been done by a Harvard professor on a concept called implicit bias. And what she does is she gives you these little tests. Here's a list of 20 qualities. 2 columns. Check off all the things you associate with boys. Column A, with girls, column B. All right. Okay, that took you 11 seconds. Now check all the boxes of things that historically were associated with boys, but check them under girls, and vice versa. Shit, that took 25 seconds. Should take the same amount of time. Same thing when you do it on a racial issue. And she uses this testing method to really show you, in fact, to reveal your built-in biases. And society is so powerful in how it socializes us that often people take in some of society's biases against their own group, associating negative qualities unfairly with their own racial or ethnic group. The one thing that she's found that statistically predicts lack of bias is dating across the racial or ethnic line. Doesn't matter how damn enlightened you are as a human being, you probably still will demonstrate some of the same bias. But if you've got to the point in your life where you've been romantically involved with someone of the other group, that seems to break it down. So I thought that shadow last moment was potentially an important and interesting moment.
Okay. You mentioned the cast of the Legion being so large earlier, which is one of the things that drew me to the book as a young child. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how you went about, or even now go about, shining the spotlight on certain characters. Some of them come, some of them go. It's always been a very rotating cast in the Legion, at least in the 80s especially.
Well, it is, I think, one of the fundamental strengths of the book, the fact that you can screw with their different lives and have more change and more transition than you can have in many titles. And it's extraordinarily challenging to write a book like Superman, where you sort of know Superman and Lois are going to be alive at the end of the book. So how do we show change? How do we show development? I keep a scrap note that just keeps getting rewritten of where I last saw all of the characters, and you go through and it's sort of like, hey, use them a lot lately, use them a lot lately. Haven't done anything in a while. And you try to remember. And it's never a fair balance, but try to work your way around the room. Weren't sure.
Well, there's never really been a bad Legion book. I mean, every version of
Okay,
Legion.
really, if you come downstairs, I can find you a few, and
yeah,
I'll watch you read them, and I'll watch the pain.
It's always been fun. I mean, it's always been a fun book. Every incarnation of Legion I've enjoyed, and I guess my question now is, what do we have coming up with? There's always new characters as characters leaving. Do you have any up-and-coming characters? I know you have Legion Academy characters right now, but do you have any coming up that you think are going to really be a big player in the book?
I think I've got a lot to work with at the moment. I mean, there's a couple of new characters who were introduced this month, maybe. Mwanji and Otaki show up, and they're around for a storyline or two. So we'll see where they go from here. There's a lot of stuff there. I gotta mind that for a while. Some new twists on some of the old villains and things coming too. That should be fun as well.
In the back?
Is there any chance of the Clark Kent version of Superboy returning to the Legion timeline at all?
Not for a while, I think. I mean, I'm sure he will eventually, but Grant's just done so much work altering that character around that I think it's a difficult time to play with it, with the Legion.
When it comes to things like character deaths or returning Laurel Kent into a manhunter, is that kind of thing, is that handed down from editorial, or do you get an opportunity to say, well, we can use this character or we can kill out this guy?
I mean, it's depended over the years, obviously. Many different people run DC through that time in many different circumstances. Generally speaking, the more valuable to the company the character is, the higher up the company goes. So if you're affecting someone who has been a movie, has been a TV show, has been a licensed toy, you need 7 signatures. If you're doing something to someone who nobody's ever heard of outside your title, maybe you need 1 signature. Kind of an oversimplified answer.
I just have a question. I understand the way, if I understand correctly, the corporate structure that you're working under now, you're kind of over for a lot of these guys, and yet you're working for them.
I'm not over nobody no more.
Okay.
I was hired help right now.
Okay.
I mean, for much of my career,
Okay, well,
I was part of the senior staff of the company
right,
on the
okay.
one-time
Just the
order.
kind of the, for lack of a better term, the schizophrenia of
Absolutely.
being there, and then I have to now subject myself to an editor who's
It all comes out of the pulp business. You know, in the pulps in the 1920s and the 1930s, traditionally, Michael, I got a job for you. You know, it's $5 a week editing Batman. And you need $10 to eat? Doesn't Rose have a job? Really? $10? All right, so every week you'll sell me a Superman story. You'll freelance for me. By the way, I'm not making a decent living either, so every week I'm going to be selling you one of those Batman stories because I could use the $5 also. And that was really the tradition of the business for decades, much less so today than in the years I was growing up. It was occasionally weird.
And you and Jeanette Kahn changed that a lot. I'd love to hear, I know we're about out of time, but any comments you had on how, what went on there?
Well, it was a combination of things. I mean, one, we did some stuff and we were lucky enough to be running the company in years when the industry was improving, maybe partly our doing, maybe partly dumb luck. So over a period of time, we were able to improve what people were making to a point where people didn't need to be moonlighting to make a living. Assistant editors are still pretty badly paid, but real full editors make a decent living these days. Lots more decently paid staff in the halls proportionately than there were when I was a kid. Pretty much everybody needed a second job. Could stand. Basically worked 2 jobs in those years. And partly, I think we work really hard to have the roles of being a freelancer and editors separated. Both of us had different concerns and feelings about the issue. Somebody being a writer and editor on their own material. But in the end, we had both come to the conclusion that that was not the best way to do comics. And moved away from it.
I'd like to add that the current issue, back issue, that I had tomorrow's, has a lengthy interview with Jeanette Kahn. It was conducted by Bob Greenberg. And it is available at tomorrow's booth. At least I hope it is. And
Really good issue.
It's a fabulous issue. I'm very pleased with that. One more question. You were the first.
I make more of a comment than anything else. He asked you earlier what you thought you brought to the table, from a modesty aside. As a reader who's been around since Dave Cockrum was doing the artworks, that tells you how long I've been a Legion fan. Your dialogue and the interplay between characters is better than anybody was writing, except for maybe Chris Claremont. But the beautiful part about it is you finish up the storyline.
List of the ones I left hanging, or that I've still got hanging out there. There's a few, but yes, I think Chris is a dear friend. I do think I had a better batting average about cleaning up after myself that way. But I think he's certainly a better dialogue writer than I am.
The final part of the question is there any story that you really wanted to tell with the Legion that you've never got to tell, and maybe like Jim Shooter, you'll finally get to tell that story one day?
There's stuff left to do. I mean, I wouldn't be still playing with the characters if I didn't think there were tales to tell. A big book of ideas scribbled there of things I want to do. But their lives are rich lives as characters. There are more stories to tell. So I'd like to get to do some of that. I'm not in the great dialogue concepts business. I'll try reading some of it aloud one of these days. There were moments, but I'm a plot guy. I'll hold my plotting up against pretty much anyone in the business. But discussion with one of the Warner execs at one point who was trying to talk me into doing some film writing. But it's just not going to be my medium. I'm just not good enough at dialogue to be a spoken dialogue guy. Nuance and all of that. And I don't think that's an issue of immodesty, modesty or immodesty. I think that's just sort of objectively where I score on it. I mean, even look at the fact that people remember the Darkness story as my prime book. I mean, that fundamentally was a plot thing. It's the melodrama moment that you remember the planet turning, the dark side's face revealing, and you remember the complexity of the servants. It's not the line you remember in the same way that you might, it's an imaginary story, aren't they all? That's a quality of writing, of pure writing, that Alan can do many, many times that I ain't never gonna have. My total respect for guys like Alan and Neil who have that level of brilliant command of the language.
Well, and on that note,